Alrighty, Zaid, welcome to the show, Proof of Truth.
Thank you, Cole. Excited for a great conversation here about circadian magic and whatever else we stumble upon.
Circadian magic, yeah, love that. So I'd love for you to introduce yourself a little bit, tell us what you major in, so to speak, and what you care about.
Yeah, so for me, competitive soccer player growing up, started playing at the age of 4, went to try to pursue that professionally until like 24, 25. So I call that my first passion. That's where I really learned a lot about discipline and consistency, a lot of this stuff that I think translates into the work that I do now. But I think the pivotal moment for me was experiencing my father's passing from his second heart attack within the span of a year. And so that put him into a coma. It was a myocardial infarction, which is, what centralized medicine calls the widowmaker these days. And that really shifted my thinking from going more so, from an athletic standpoint, diving into holistic health, so to speak. And so going down the rabbit holes of nutrition, detox, supplementation, movement, all that stuff. And then eventually finding circadian biology, which is really, I think, the end point for me. I think this is like the thing that I want to do for the rest of my life, because I really do think it is a root cause, first principles understanding of human biology. And in terms of like certifications or degrees, I have none of that to my name. I'm more of an obsessed type who enjoys learning. So, I often call myself an autodidact because I just like to learn by myself and really build upon the knowledge that I've developed.
For sure, yeah, same here. And you touched on it a little bit, but I love the question why. Like, why do you care about what you care about? Why is your mission and what you talk about so important to you?
Well, on one hand, I want to definitely avoid the fate that, my father experienced. Like nobody wants to die
Yeah,
of heart disease at the age of 51, right? And so even though he was super fit, he was actually my physical education teacher growing up because I went to a private school. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're protected from chronic disease. And I think there are a lot of other modalities and avenues that you have to explore in order to understand this game comprehensively for that goal. And then there's also one part of health optimization. I'm just generally very interested in this work, and I'm naturally obsessed with it in the sense that I just gravitate towards understanding things and building upon previous knowledge and just understanding epistemology in general. And so for me, that's a big motivation. As I have like evolved within this work, a big part of it is trying to help people from very serious health consequences or very serious diseases, but more so prevention on that end as well. I do get a lot of satisfaction from seeing people, have that light bulb in their mind turn on, so to speak.
yeah, and be proactive about it. And you mentioned health optimization, and we'll talk about that plenty. But I was curious to give you the floor to talk about if you could take somebody and give them the least optimal health patterns and behaviors and routines. What, like A to Z, you can be as brutal and savage as you'd like. What would you do just to absolutely wreck their biology and functioning as a human being?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say honestly live like the average American. It sounds so satirical, but it's true because
Yeah.
if you look at chronic disease rates, I mean they're skyrocketing more than ever before. And I think there are very real reasons behind that from a lifestyle perspective. And so, spend most of your time indoors. Don't think about circadian biology or the quality of light within your environment. Eat whatever you feel like eating according to your cravings that are especially dictated by the sleep deprivation you've experienced over the past however many months and years. Have terrible relationships, fight with your wife, your mother, your brother, sister, whatever. Um, Basically, just being, I think the root cause of poor health in this day and age is a lack of education. And I do think that this combination of low dopamine and melatonin behavior contributes heavily to people being more apathetic and not willing to look into this work to begin with. And I think
Yeah.
that's even more problematic when you consider what kind of messaging these people are receiving from, the centralized practitioners, especially like the dermatologists, in regards to sun avoidance, sunglasses, all that other nonsense, to be honest.
Yeah, you mentioned staying indoors all day and light environment, and this has been a big unlock for me to the point where it's now non-negotiable. From the phone at nighttime, the lights that I use in general, and LEDs and fluorescent lights and artificial lighting in general is a big a big space where a lot of people lack education, and it can be a super kind of a silent killer, so to speak. So I'm curious to hear more on the science behind why LEDs and fluorescent and artificial lighting can be so bad for us as human beings.
I think the root of it all is really that it just causes circadian disruption. So if you look at how an LED is set up, we could talk about a high flicker rate, which impacts the system at large. We could talk about non-native EMFs independent of light, which is just a part of the electromagnetic spectrum. But if you take a look at the light spectrum involved with LEDs or modern lighting, it's completely biased towards this high spike of blue without any red or infrared. So there's no balanced spectrum in the same way that you would find a balanced spectrum from incandescence or firelight or even the sun. And so I think that's the root cause of why it's so detrimental to the system, because the entire human body is a circadian system built around light. And so your body is always sensing what light is in the environment and what spectrum it has according to also the time of day. Because your body is very sophisticated in that sense, to where it can use and sense different spectrums of light to then go about systemic function. So I would probably say those three things are the biggest thing: the light spectrum, non-native EMFs, and then the flicker rate for sure.
Yeah, then even more specifically, how does blue light from phones and devices and TVs impact us severely? Because that's everywhere. It's an epidemic, arguably.
Well, there are many ways that it can impact the human body. We have a light-sensing protein, the most abundant chromophore essentially in the body, known as melanopsin, and it senses blue light. So the human body is really oriented around sensing blue most notably, along with the other wavelengths, of course. But blue is particularly important because of circadian timing and a whole bunch of other things. But let's say, if you expose yourself to blue light in isolation at night, you're destroying the melatonin that the pineal gland is able to produce, which, melatonin being anti-cancer, antioxidant, long list of health benefits. That's problematic over the long term, 10, 20, 30 years. Then you get into things like, the opsin family. Like I said, melanopsin is one of them. You have rhodopsin, encephalopsin. These are all light-sensing proteins designed to sense various wavelengths of light for different purposes. The thing about these opsins and the opsin family in general is that they're tied to the vitamin A cycle. And so when you get blue light in isolation, it will actually break apart the covalent bond involved with that vitamin A cycle tied to the opsins. And then that's where you get into freed retinol, which is very problematic. And then downstream of that, you have a phenomenon known as ferroptosis. This is a recent discovery in biology to where it's basically an iron-dependent form of cell death that causes various problems within the system. And so, again, many different ways that isolated blue can destroy the body, but it's a very real thing.
Yeah, for sure. And what would be some of the more specific ways that it can destroy the body?
So let's say if we think about the circadian system, it's all about timing. And so when we interact with isolated blue light, it throws off the timing of the system overall. So, your suprachiasmatic nucleus in the brain, the master circadian clock, will take in that isolated blue, and it will essentially trick the body into thinking it's daytime. So it will throw off not only the SCN, the master circadian clock, but then it throws off the signal to the peripheral clocks linked to, your kidneys, all the rest of your other organs, all cells in the body. And so through that logic, we understand that, let's say, insulin production and glucose homeostasis is under circadian control. So through that logic, you can essentially say that if you throw off the timing of the system, then you can get into problems like prediabetes and just an overloaded insulin response, things of that nature. And you essentially extrapolate that to every part of the body, whether it's the heart, whether it's the brain, when it comes to neurodegeneration. Again, it's incredible how far-reaching this is.
Yeah, and you talk about how all forms of cancer really can tie into the circadian clock and lack of sunlight and all of this stuff. How do those things tie together? I think there was a word maybe you use, like apoptosis or something like that. I'm not sure if that's the way you pronounce it, but I'm very curious about that.
Yeah, so apoptosis is one anti-cancer defense system in the body. Okay. A lot of people call apoptosis essentially programmed cell death. So, your cell gets a certain signal from various different sources within the environment that essentially tell it to commit suicide because it is a damaged cell. And so that's how the body cleans up a lot of these damaged organelles and cells in general. Then you have autophagy. That's basically like the recycling center process of the body where it takes damaged organelles and then repurposes them for new ones. But essentially, if you look at cancer in general and how the body works, all anti-cancer processes are under circadian control. And so that's where the light ties in, that's where food intake ties in. And it points to a broader discussion within the cancer realm, which is, what happens to the body when all of the anti-cancer processes like autophagy, apoptosis, DNA repair cycles, tumor suppressor genes get destroyed through chronic circadian disruption. Obviously, you have an increased risk of higher cancer manifestation. And so that's, I think, a big part of it. And, that also ties into vitamin D3, endogenous melatonin, powerful anti-cancer compounds that are protective as well. But either way, I think that also ties into the skin cancer discussion and a whole bunch of other things.
Yeah, and I think it ties into the importance of the sun too. And the sun causes skin cancer. The sun causes cancer. That's got to be one of the biggest false narratives today. I'm curious for you to debunk that, and then we can get a little bit more into the importance of it and how it ties into the circadian clock and everything like that.
Yeah, if you take a first principles circadian lens to this topic, it's actually pretty easy to debunk. I mean, number one, you have the fact that, let's start off with centralized medicine's understanding of this work. They believe that full spectrum sunlight causes photoaging and skin cancers. But if you look at the original research that they use across the board through many different decades on that assumption, they're actually using isolated UV on nocturnal animals or skin cell cultures in vitro within an artificial blue lit environment that has a lot of non-native EMF pollution in laboratory settings. So that's a big problem because out the gate, your research is fundamentally flawed from many different angles.
Yeah.
We are not mice. We have some similarities to mice, but when it comes to the circadian mechanisms, that we're not the same at all, because obviously mice are nocturnal, we are diurnal, meant to be awake during the day and asleep at night, where for mice that's reversed. We're obviously not a clump of skin cells, because if you just study in vitro, you're removing the synergistic effect of human biology, meaning you're removing the melanin, you're removing the reactive oxygen species, you're removing the communication that every part of the body has with one another. And so I often say that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
Yeah.
And this also ties into one of the problems with centralized science, which is that it's fundamentally reductive. They only look at one part of the system. They don't look at how every part of the system interacts with one another. Where on the opposite end, I'm taking a more holistic approach to understand the body from a comprehensive standpoint. So that's a problem. They're studying UV light in isolation in the wrong context. They don't understand that the sun's full spectrum and its wavelengths have a synergistic relationship to one another. So one example of this in the Journal of Dermatology, actually in 1998, they did a study showing that near-infrared light actually stops cytotoxicity or cell toxicity from isolated UV. And so that gives us a very clear picture that, okay, near-infrared has a relationship with UV to create a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. Obviously, that takes place with red, green, blue, yellow, all these other wavelengths as well. And more importantly, in nature, you don't find blue or UV in isolation. So You always find UV and blue paired with red and infrared, most notably. So I think that's a big problem. You have companies like L'Oreal and Nestle in the 50s, 60s, 70s who actively created PR campaigns to demonize the sun in the public domain. And that eventually led to a lot of the public messaging, the World Health Organization taking on a lot of these recommendations. And interestingly enough, like if you look at L'Oreal and Nestle, what do you think their goal is? To sell more product. L'Oreal, with more sunscreens, sun creams, all that, retinols, all that garbage. And so I think there's a lot more to this, but when you combine all this into one framework, it begins to make sense as to how we got to this point.
Yeah, so if I understand you correctly, the studies that say that the sun causes skin cancer didn't actually use the sun in its full spectrum in the study.
Exactly. That's the core of it.
That's insane.
And essentially,
that debunks it right there.
Exactly. And that's why I call centralized dermatology a house of cards, because that is their foundational knowledge. That's like the base layer of what they're using to create all these other assumptions, especially the recommendations that they're giving out. And so once you understand that, the entire thing changes. The entire dynamic of what you're understanding about these subjects changes completely.
Yeah, completely. And tell us more about the actual importance of the sun and why we need to be dialing in our circadian clocks with the sun and everything that goes with that.
So real quick, before I get into that, we also have to consider that centralized science, more so dermatology, they almost exclusively use epidemiological data as well outside of what I just mentioned. So these are observational or associational studies that don't give us any truth whatsoever. Meaning, if you've ever heard a dermatologist say that if you get a burn when you're 5 years old, you're like at a 400x increase of getting skin cancer when you're older, that's not true. That's based off of epidemiology. So again, just another layer to add on to
What
this.
is epidemiology?
I mean, you're basically studying observational and associational data. And they're aggregating a lot of these observational and associational studies and making a more quote unquote educated guess as to what's happening.
Okay. So they're looking at a burn and things that are associated with it and tying them together.
It's like how the vegans say that meat causes cancer, but the studies being done are not excluding for the fact that the average American is consuming hot dogs and hamburgers and doing all this other crap.
With seed oils and everything that comes with it. Yeah.
Exactly. And so tying into the full spectrum, we have to understand that the full spectrum is broken up into various, let's say, combinations. It's probably not the right word, but you have UV light, which makes up around 3 to 5% of the total spectrum. You have visible light, which makes up 42 to 45%, and then you have infrared, which makes up about 50 to 55%. So all of these wavelengths are providing a health benefit, and even more so synergistically. So UV light, you have UVA, UVB, UVC. UVC doesn't make it through the atmosphere, but our bodies actually produce it in the form of biophotons through mitochondrial respiration or oxidative phosphorylation. UVA is very important for POMC stimulation, the same with UVB. POMC is known as pro-opiomelanocortin. It's basically like the drug factory in your body that produces the world's most powerful peptide hormones. So MSH family, melanocyte-stimulating hormone, beta-endorphin and opioid peptide, CART, the same thing, it's an abbreviation, and a bunch of other peptide hormones that are like anti-inflammatory, appetite suppressant, incredible across the board. And then UVA stimulates nitric oxide within the skin, opening up your blood vessels, acting as a vasodilator, meaning improved cardiovascular outcomes. UVB is the only light wavelength range responsible for vitamin D3 production. So, if you're using a high SPF sunscreen that blocks 95 to 98% of UVB, do you think you're going to be producing a good amount of vitamin D3? No.
No way. Yeah.
So that's another thing to it. If you go into the visible range, that's where red's included. Think of red light therapy. This is where you essentially have the rainbow. And so green, through the work of Tom Seeger, has been shown to be efficacious for all sorts of headaches. Yellow, orange, all of these things have independent skin health benefits as well. Blue, we talked about melanopsin, circadian signaling. Blue has even been shown to reduce the size of fat cells and also increase the rate at which fat cells burn fat. So it has a metabolic effect. What else do we have? Red, we know about red, just absolutely powerful across the board through red light therapy research. And then you go into the infrared range, which I think is disrespected. That's really where we have an infrared deficiency in society. But infrared can, stimulate blood flow independent of other factors. It heals the skin, red and infrared, to create collagen, elastin, hyaluronic acid. But you get my point. It's a pretty comprehensive list of benefits from all angles.
Yeah, and it's been incredibly frustrating to see the sun get villainized the way that it has. What's kind of your take on that? And you mentioned a little bit as to why they're doing it and perhaps the incentives behind that. But why do you think that is, more specifically?
Yeah, like I said, I think it's a house of cards. I think it's mostly people who are pushing this narrative that they don't really understand. A lot of people hear about, you have to wear your sunscreen, and they don't understand anything about sunscreen. They don't understand anything about circadian or photobiology. And that is especially true for the dermatologists because they don't learn circadian biology in their medical curriculum. And so when you understand that, it blows up, blows the door wide open on this entire subject. And even if you go back into history, like there have been there's been a very clear set of things that had to happen in order for us to get to this point. Like you go from the early 1900s where we had heliotherapy, healing tuberculosis and other crazy conditions, all the way up till the 1910 Flexner Report, which was influenced by J.D. Rockefeller, and he owned a lot of he owned oil essentially, and pharmaceutical drugs came from petroleum. So there's a huge connection there. But I think the 1910 Flexner Report was really damaging because it centralized medicine. They shut down a bunch of hospitals. They went down more so of the path of pharmaceutical drugs and surgery, and they essentially demonized anything holistic or more alternative, let's say, which included the sun and all that stuff. So, I think that's a big problem, and I think that really explains how we got to this point of demonizing the sun. And I just think most people are just ignorant. They just don't understand this work, and they don't care to understand this work.
Yeah, and even I might not have the understanding that you or other people have, but I make the point that if the sun was bad, we wouldn't be here. Like that's kind of obvious to say at this point. But you mentioned, I was thinking about it right when you said it, these heliotherapy clinics that we used to have in Austria or other places around the world. Tell us a little bit more about the history there, and they've fallen off the wayside a little bit, but also the positive impact that they had and the healing powers that were able to be delivered through them.
Yeah, I think after the 1910 Flexner Report, I think these individuals had a clear understanding of heliotherapy and its power, because it is a direct threat to pharmaceutical drugs and surgery and all this other stuff that we're talking about. But if you look at, let's say it started, I don't know the exact date, maybe 1901, 1902, but you have an individual by the name of Niels Ryberg-Finsen, who was essentially a light researcher. He studied the relationship of full spectrum sunlight and even isolated wavelengths to various conditions like smallpox, treated red light, or treated smallpox through red light exposure. But I think the main thing was tuberculosis, because if you think about how people moved through the Industrial Revolution from more of a farm living situation, more in nature outdoors, to these huge overly populated cities indoors, that's where we start to see huge problems with public sanitation. I mean, these people were literally living in their own shit. I'm not even exaggerating. And so that's where you see a lot of these problems with rickets, with tuberculosis, especially lupus vulgaris, which is tuberculosis of the skin. And so Niels Ryberg-Finsen won the Nobel Prize on his work studying that relationship. And he had some incredible results across the board. Like, he would actually heal people through putting full spectrum sunlight concentrated through quartz glass. Quartz is one of the few materials that allows the full spectrum to pass through, and actually intensifies UV to a certain degree as well. And incredible results in terms of healing tuberculosis. But I think even after that, you have Auguste Rollier, who was the first heliotherapist. And he used a lot of Finsen's work and really implemented heliotherapy at scale in places like Austria that you mentioned. And there may have been other places as well, but I think that was the main one. But essentially, they put patients in high latitude conditions with a lot more UV light. They progressively sunbathed them. And, you're talking about transformations of like a 9-year-old who was on the edge of death, maybe 2 weeks away from death from lupus vulgaris. 4 to 5 months later, he's completely healed and he's rocking a lean tan. Wow. So this is very powerful stuff. And it makes sense when you understand the modern scientific literature, because a lot of these people didn't understand modern science. They didn't have that at their disposal, but they understood observation and alternative methods of healing these certain conditions.
Yeah, I saw a post from you a while back where I believe it was in the 1930s, where the U.S. government put out something on how to effectively build a solar callus. I believe specifically for younger children, but to hear that is shocking, and where it's at now is night and day different. But what did that governmental piece say, and what is the importance of building a solar callus, and what's the best way to go about it?
That was a 1931 pamphlet. It was essentially a set of government recommendations for families because of the context that I mentioned previously, to build resilience within their, not only the family in general, but also babies as well, more specifically. And so if you look through the pamphlet, by the way, this comes from the U.S. Department of Labor's Child's Bureau Department. So it was from the government itself, but they essentially listed out how to actually build more melanin and how to develop a good relationship with full spectrum sunlight exposure by getting most of the skin exposed. And so they understand the difference between latitude, season, UV index. They understood the difference between the window open and closed, which is a big one. And, I was pretty shocked to see how wise these people were back in that day, because if you look at dermatologists or any centralized practitioners today, they're just going to give you a bunch of BS that revolves around, oh, sun is bad and, it causes photoaging and skin cancers. But, and I do think a large part of that does come from the Flexner report. But essentially the importance of building a solar callus or a tan is that not only do you have Mother Nature's most effective sunscreen working for you, but you're also building a lot of other health benefits through the development of melanin, which all skin types can do, that you get on the back end. So, melanin's a radioprotective, anti-inflammatory, antioxidant. It's responsible for so many different things, which is why we want to build more melanin, as opposed to centralized orthodoxy, which says that melanin is exclusively a sign of skin or DNA damage.
Why is that not true? I mean, because people are born with more melanin, right? So that wouldn't necessarily make sense that they're born with more DNA or skin damage.
Exactly. It's so absurd that it's literally bordering on scientific racism and eugenics. Which is why that's like something that dermatologists don't want to touch with a 10-foot pole. But it makes sense because it ties directly into the history of those two subjects. And so for me, if we understand that dermatologists have a very reductive view of biology, it only makes sense that they think of melanin production as DNA damage or skin damage, because they're only looking at one isolated part of the process. Whereas if you look at how melanin is developed through UVB, for example, UVB creates these DNA mutations known as thymine dimers. And the thing about thymine dimers is that they are DNA mutations, but they're a hormetic effect. And what happens is that the body has these very intricate systems in order to immediately heal or fix those thymine dimers. And so you have things like vitamin D3, which is also made from UVB, that heals thymine dimers on the back end, so to speak. You have things like nucleotide excision repair, which heal or change DNA to its original state and create a more stronger organism. In general, if you look at all anti-cancer processes, they are most upregulated during midday when you get the most radiation from the sun. So this is often why I say if you are going to get some sort of radiological testing, whether it's an X-ray or something else, you want to do that during the midday portion because of that very fact. And you also want to prime the skin in the morning time in order to really tell your body from a circadian signaling standpoint that UV or more radiation is coming. And so you'll be most protected from that perspective.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. And I was curious to ask you if you were, and you could talk about, centralized derma and more of your gripes about it to begin with, but if you were to build, in essence, your own school of dermatology, and how would preach about the skin and tying it in with circadian clocks and the sun and everything, how would you go about designing that so that we're fully understanding and properly educated?
That's a great question. I mean, I will say there may be aspects of this that I don't fully understand to where I can create a clinic per se, but I would say that dermatologists need to upgrade their epistemology to where they need to have circadian biology as the foundation for their understanding of the skin. And so they have to have a circadian lens applied to all the work that they do in relation to hyperpigmentation, melasma, psoriasis, eczema. And funny enough, they almost kind of do this to a certain degree, but from a very reductive standpoint. Like, these are people who fundamentally say that UV light from full spectrum sunlight is bad and damaging, and increases your cancer risk. But on the other end of the equation, they're also using isolated UV and all these other wavelengths within their clinics to heal chronic inflammatory skin conditions. So that's like one of the major glaring contradictions that I just can't get over. But yeah, it's essentially just having dermatologists take that circadian lens and apply circadian alignment and biology to the body in general to have a more comprehensive and holistic understanding of this work, to where they can actually get great outcomes for patients who have either been diagnosed with a skin condition or some sort of skin cancer. And then, you can have some sort of blend between centralized and decentralized dermatology to then create just a better outcome for patients overall.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds awesome. What would you say are the fundamentals of circadian health and biological function and making sure that we're in tune with, sunrise and sunset and everything that comes with that?
Just from a lifestyle, like action standpoint, or something?
Yeah, like what could the average person do to be fundamentally in line with optimal circadian health?
Well, I would say watching sunrise is probably the most powerful thing you can do. That's like the first, I often call it the first domino you push to create good timing in the circadian system. But, AM sunlight is rich in red and infrared, create collagen, elastin, and hyaluronic acid within the skin. It'll set the circadian skin clocks correct, meaning they're timed correct to the point where they're prepared for UV when it comes out. UVA rise is particularly important because it'll actually create the most optimal neurotransmitter pathways, in the sense that there are these aromatic amino acids within the eyes and skin that absorb UV and then go about in order to create dopamine, adrenaline, melatonin, serotonin, all these fundamental hormones and neurotransmitters. That's very important. UVA rise, which typically happens an hour after sunrise. So I recommend generally 15 to 20 minutes at least within those two windows. And then that's where you get into the midday sunbathing. You have to approach this progressively. In the same way that you train, you have to use progressive overload, which means you warm up for the training session, you get into the training session, and then you recover. That essentially encapsulates hormesis, which all life is built upon, meaning you get stronger through gradual and intentional exposure to a stressor. But yeah, I mean, depending on skin type, you're going to have to be very intentional about that process. So whether it's 5 minutes of midday exposure, whether it's 30 minutes if you're really dark skinned, that'll differ. And that's the reason why I wrote, the Solar Callus Guide, which is an article on my Substack. Outside of that, making it dark after sunset is very key. That's, light and dark cycle is a natural duality. So having all these things in check is going to be very important, whether you want to optimize health as an athlete or a biohacker, or, you want to make sure that you heal from some sort of condition. That's going to be very important.
Yeah, for somebody that has consistently shot themselves in the foot, or they're really behind the eight ball when it comes to health for, an extended period of time, where would you kind of start them to getting back to optimized health and biological function? Where would you kind of point them to and coach them?
So in the sense that, like, this is somebody who is just completely healthy, like standard average American?
Like, yeah, standard healthy, standard average American who eats fast food a bunch and looks at their blue light phone at 10 p.m. at night every night and doesn't get out in the sun, everything that in that sphere.
Yeah, I mean, there's some points where, you can make the argument that if you start telling somebody like that to watch sunrise and get up 3 to 4 hours prior to when they actually wake up normally, that's going to be a sticking point for them, and they're likely to not follow through with it. Mm-hmm. So for me, I would just tell them to spend more time outside in shade. Even if you work under shade, you're still getting the full spectrum for the most part outside of UV, interacting with your body, and you're gaining a lot of health benefit, especially if you're in nature, a lot of greenery, which reflects near-infrared light for many different purposes in the body. That's one point. And then, maybe giving them the recommendation of getting a pair of dark orange or red blue blockers for the nighttime. Because whenever I tell people or give people a pair of these blue blockers who are not into this work, within 5 to 10 minutes, they're already like super tired, which is interesting because you're kind of wanting to bridge the gap between what they haven't experienced versus their direct felt experience. And
Yeah.
so if I can immediately give them a direct felt experience that they notice and that benefits them, then they're more likely to get into the work and have their cake and eat it too, so to speak.
Yeah, open their minds up a little bit. And for somebody that, wakes up earlier, closer to sunrise, and has a few healthy practices and maybe understands it a little bit, but they haven't really gotten too deep into it, and they don't have too great of an understanding about it, kind of like middle of the road health wise, what would you advise them to do to dial in more to take their health from good to great?
It's probably the combination of, it revolves around building more melanin for sure. I think that's just an incredible leverage point for a lot of people that has many different systemic effects. And so the combination of sunbathing in the morning time before UV comes out, getting most of the skin exposed to prime the skin, and then really utilizing that microdosed midday strategy, depending on the person. I mean, if you're a redhead who has no experience, like 1 or 2 minutes in midday sun is enough.
Mm-hmm.
But the point is, we want to build melanin without burning to where you can develop more of a hormetic adaptation so that you can have more time to spend in the future. And so I think this is most poignant for redheads or lighter skinned people because they often say that they can't sunbathe because they burn very quickly. The AM sunbathing in the microdosed midday and then the nighttime darkness is a way around that in a natural fashion. And so outside of that, taking the sunglasses off with the same concept, getting used to full spectrum sunlight in high lux, which is light intensity, that's one change that has a dramatic effect on the system at large as well.
Yeah, you read my mind again. I was going to ask you about sunglasses because people will say, okay, I'll get out in the sun, but then they're like, it's so bright. And they put on these, sun blockers that completely destroy the signaling that's required to receive the sun, efficiently and healthily. You call it one of the worst inventions of all time, sunglasses. Why is that? And what's the importance of not having them on? And why is it actually so bad that people do wear them?
Well, there are many different layers to this. There's a philosophical layer where I think that, if you believe in God or evolutionary biology or even both simultaneously, which I'm more inclined to believe, you're blocking God's light out, which is inherently beneficial to all life on Earth. So why would you be wearing sunglasses from that perspective? From the scientific and circadian perspective, it's a lot easier to tell people that there are some very real reasons and there are second and third order consequences that come from sunglasses use. So the reason why people have sensitive eyes is not because God gave them sensitive eyes. I mean, even from an evolutionary standpoint, like your eyes are designed to interface with the sun's full spectrum in high lux. So the reason why you have that light sensitivity is because you chronically wear sunglasses. So
Right.
The very thing you're using to protect from full spectrum sunlight, so to speak, is actually causing one of the side effects, which is light sensitivity. And that's easily explained through things like melanopsin within the eye, within these intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. It's actually, when you get high intensity or high lux light through the eyes peripherally, a melanopsin is designed to essentially create dopamine in the eye. And melanopsin and dopamine work together as best friends to basically create more resilience in the system and create more photoadaptation, meaning your eyes adapt better to different light levels in the environment. And so that's one big circadian piece to it. The eyes are the gateway to neurotransmitter and hormone production. If you look at the work of, Fritz Holwich in the early 1900s, he studied the relationship between full spectrum sunlight in the eyes in relation to its endocrine effects. And so he noticed that if you take human beings or other species that have cataracts, which block the majority of the full spectrum, and you remove those cataracts, interestingly enough, you see changes in cortisol, changes in testosterone, estradiol, progesterone across the board. And so that's another reason to avoid sunglasses use. And then you have the obvious reason that a lot of social media influencers talk about, but I don't think they do a good job of explaining it, is that sunglasses use during midday UV exposure makes you more susceptible to burns because it blocks the peripheral UV signal into the eyes, which then talks to the skin to then create melanin production through MSH. And so you have UV light getting to the eyes peripherally, stimulating the POMC system. POMC makes alpha MSH. Alpha MSH makes melanin. That's how you get that hormetic adaptation and protective effect. And again, I mentioned that melanin is nature's most effective sunscreen. So eumelanin in darker individuals, the blacks and browns in nature, is responsible for blocking 99.9% of UV. And then pheomelanin is less protective, around 20 to 40%. But either way, regardless of skin type, you can build more melanin to where you don't burn at all, and you can have more time in the sun.
And so talk about the effect of latitude. Like those closer to the equator tend to have more melanin because they're closer to the sun effectively over time. And you mentioned it takes longer for them to actually receive some of the benefits. They might need to be out in the sun longer, but they also have more of a natural protection against the sun. I'm curious the details behind all of that.
Yeah, of course. If you look at migration patterns of human beings, I mean, we technically, I don't know how long ago this was, a long time. But I believe we originated within this continental African rift or something. They call it some sort of specific thing like that. But we originated in Africa, essentially. Mm-hmm. So when you track migratory patterns, especially according to haplotype, you notice that people go from more of the equatorial environment to higher latitude environment. And so people over time, this is an adaptation that has taken a very long time to produce, but over time, higher latitude individuals developed lighter skin in order to compensate for the lack of UV light. So lighter skin is essentially a way to be more efficient with UV light absorption at higher latitude, which is an interesting twist to it compared to what most people in the centralized orthodoxy say. And so, of course, if you're at the equator and you have darker skin, then it takes you a lot longer to build more melanin and more specifically to produce vitamin D3 because of the fact that eumelanin blocks 99% of all UV. Incredible photoprotective effects from eumelanin. And so it just takes them longer to sunbathe. And I think that's more problematic because that messaging is not being told by the dermatologist. They're just saying, use sunscreen across the board. They're not even mentioning skin type, which is insane to me. And so that's also another problem in my mind.
Yeah, and let's say somebody, a Norwegian comes down to the Caribbean and they want to be out in the sun for a week and they're told, and perhaps rightfully so to some degree, to use sunscreen because if they're blasting themselves, from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m., they're going to get burnt because they're not necessarily built for it. What would you advise somebody like that to build melanin and build the natural protection to where they don't need sunscreen?
So yeah, for them, I mean, again, it goes back to the AM sunbathing first. That's the first and foremost thing that they have to implement and be very religious about because, they just have less leverage to begin with. And so you need to really dial in that morning period of sunbathing. And then you have to microdose the midday UV. And so, when you get enough UV, there's an intuitive aspect to this as well. You need to use clothing, you need to use shade. All animals in nature seek sun and then seek shade, natural duality. And so from that perspective, I think that's very important. And then the nighttime darkness is obviously very key because the skin repairs itself comprehensively in darkness and at nighttime during sleep. So, if you're somebody who just goes straight to midday UV being lighter skin, you're going to burn very quickly, no doubt. Now, you can use sunscreen to avoid a burn, but there are what I call iatrogenic second and third order consequences to that. So, and that's another discussion we can talk about, but essentially, what was the original point outside of the what to do specifically?
Yeah, just like how we got there, which you touched on, and what to do was the next point. Yeah.
Yeah, my mind's racing a million miles per hour. So
yeah, no worries.
In terms of, that leverage, you just have a lot more leverage with darker skinned people. And so, being at the equator, they don't need to really be as strict about that stuff. But again, I would rather have people implement a circadian aligned protocol across the board.
And you've mentioned sunscreen multiple times, and I'm curious, would you say that sunscreen is a scam? And I've even seen you say that all sunscreen, including the mineral sunscreens, can be more so in that group than people tend to think. And why is that? Why is sunscreen so detrimental?
Yeah, I like to educate on sunscreen from a high level. I have no problem saying it's a scam, but also at the same time, I do understand that, occasionally, very rarely, if you need to use a mineral-based zinc oxide sunscreen to avoid a burn, sure. I think there's a lot of nuance within the burn discussion as well, which we can touch on. But for me, if you look at the second and third order consequences of sunscreen use over the long term, you have, number one, its ability to alter the full spectrum in the same way that low emission glass does. You don't want to block UVA and UVB, which sunscreen is designed to do. Again, we mentioned the benefits with UV light. That will interrupt the process of melanogenesis, meaning you won't be able to produce melanin, meaning you won't be hormetically adapted, aka you will just leave yourself more susceptible to burns over the long term. And then you'll use more sunscreen because you don't understand what you're doing. So that's one portion of it. Most sunscreen options do not touch blue light, which is a high energy wavelength that penetrates the skin. And so if you're blocking UV, you allow blue in, and even nowadays there are infrared blocking sunscreen options, which is crazy. Then you're altering the spectrum, which has a very real impact on the skin barrier, which is a very complex circadian light sensing organ. And so all the processes within the skin barrier are attuned to full spectrum sunlight, not altered spectrum light. That's one thing. You get into the chemical sunscreens, you're talking about photocarcinogens like avobenzone, oxybenzone. These chemicals in and of themselves aren't necessarily problematic in my mind. But when you put them on at the beach and they interact with high light or high intensity UV, a lot of light and heat, they actually transform into photocarcinogens, which are cancer causing compounds that increase your risk of developing cancer. Even worse than that with sunscreen use, especially on the chemical front, is that when you put them on and they interact with that high heat and midday UV, they create a situation where you have excess free radical runaway. And so you have excess production of reactive oxygen species as well as reactive nitrogen species. And that basically creates a skin situation where your body is not able to handle that. And over the long term, this creates oxidative damage, which then, lo and behold, is one of the hallmarks of cancer manifestation. So again, you're seeing all these different things combine into one, and it only makes sense why I think it's a contributing factor to chronic disease, through secondary effects, and why skin cancer rates are skyrocketing at an all-time high. Do I believe that sunscreen use causes skin cancer? No. I think it's a lot more complex. I think that the literature does not show that, but I do think it contributes to a skin environment through circadian disruption to where it increases your risk of developing cancer. And so people confuse this all the time. There's a massive difference between increasing your risk of skin cancer development and causing cancer. It's two very different things.
Definitely. We've talked about sunglasses and sunscreen, but I think the area where there's probably the most lacking of education is with prescription glasses and contact lenses, and how they can actually prevent our ability to receive the sun properly. And that was something that's eye-opening for me, pun not intended, because I wear contact lenses and I'm highly dependent on them because I'm a negative 3.75, so I don't have them on, I wouldn't be able to drive a car. Yeah. And so for somebody that has a high prescription like that, but wants to get out in the sun and often does, how could they best get around it? And macular regeneration might be part of the story as well there.
Yeah, this is where we get into circadian eyesight regeneration, and it's something I really stumbled upon learning about the eyes from the circadian perspective, because in my mind, you understand that myopia is at an all-time high, all these sort of weird ocular issues are skyrocketing. And then you consider the context of society. Most people are indoors. They don't get outdoor time. Then I began to really dive into the mechanisms, and it only makes sense that you can actually regenerate your eyes. And even down to if you study the work of Dr. Robert O. Becker in the 50s and 60s, he studied direct current and its circadian and electromagnetic connection to limb regeneration in not only other species like salamanders, but also human beings. And he did some very interesting work on this stuff. But interestingly enough, collagen is piezoelectric and flexoelectric. So it's able to generate free electrons. It's able to actually be regenerated in the real sense of the word, because bones do not actually heal, they regenerate completely, which is a very unique phenomenon. And so the eyes, there's a special type of collagen. I forgot what specifically the name is, but that type of collagen is very similar to bone in its unique ability to regenerate. And so within the eyes you have, mitochondria, which are light-sensing organelles that can be improved upon through a circadian framework. You have those opsins, non-visual photoreceptors, and then you have melanin. And so we're back to those three important light-sensing mechanisms that can completely be regenerated through a circadian protocol. Now, for me, I think that prescription lenses, contact lenses, they're problematic for many of the same reasons that low-emission glass and sunscreen is. Fundamentally, they alter the spectrum. They don't allow the full spectrum to get through peripherally, and that stops a lot of the regeneration potential involved with the eyes. And outside of that, contact lenses have other problems. They have forever chemicals in them that many people don't think about. That's getting into your system. They're pretty much standard to block UV and blue light these days. So again, altering the spectrum. And then they actually cause hypoxia of the cornea. And so, if you get a lack of oxygen to any part of the body, then that part of the body eventually comes across some very serious problems and, in my opinion, dies. So that's where I can make the case that it can actually worsen vision over time in the same way that prescription glasses can too. And so the way to do this is a little bit more complex, but you're going to have to, if I were to really give someone the full truth, you're going to have to get off the contact lenses. You're going to have to use prescription lenses for some time, and you're going to have to be very strict about implementing a circadian protocol. So that means sun gazing in the morning and evening time. That means no sunglasses. That means sunbathing without any lens or filter over the eye to allow the regeneration process to happen. And, just to show the power of this, and by the way, nighttime darkness is very important for that because isolated blue decimates the eyes. To show the power of this, there was a study, I think, done in Harvard, I think 2021, that showed that deep red light in the morning time stimulated a 17% improvement in color contrast vision. And that was only 1 3-minute exposure. The interesting thing about that 1 3-minute exposure is that it lasted for up to a week. So you imagine sunrise, sunset, doing all this work over the long term, massive exponential effects in terms of regeneration. And then also you have violet light. There's been a lot of good research showing violet light stops myopia progression and myopia altogether through the activation of a gene known as the EGR1 gene. And so when you compare kids who play outside versus kids who are indoors, there's a reason why kids outside have very rare instances of myopia development, whereas kids indoors have skyrocketing rates. And so there's a lot more to it, but it's an incredibly fascinating rabbit hole that I've seen people implement firsthand. I've seen people go from, -3 something to like -1. I've seen people, even older people, go from age-related macular degeneration to 20/20 vision. They're being very strict about this protocol. And so the human body has an incredible ability to regenerate and adapt.
Yeah, you mentioned the body electric, and you had a tweet that said anybody who has this book, is in the top 1%. They're very lucky to have it. Why is that book so significant in your eyes?
Because it underscores the electromagnetic nature of the human body and how incredible it is. Now, there are many different aspects of electromagnetism that I've yet to learn about. There's a lot of very deep and intricate stuff in it. But for me, when you understand that the human body is the most sophisticated circadian and electromagnetic system in the universe, in my opinion, then that really opens up an entire new world to you, because it goes to show that technology use is fundamentally damaging to the human body. Telecom companies stand to gain profit and power based off of your ignorance. On the circadian front, we talked about the dermatologists, the ophthalmologists, all that stuff. That's where you can learn to empower yourself as well. And so when you understand the body at a fundamental level when it comes to piezoelectricity or flexoelectricity, photoconduction, the living matrix in terms of free electron movement, when you understand all of these things, it goes to show that we have not been taught the truth about health. And in fact, we've been taught a very skewed and reductive view of things, which then just leads to ignorance and leads to iatrogenic and, poor advice.
Mm. Yeah, the electromagnetism is also something that I haven't really gone into, but my intuition tells me there's a lot there, and the non-native EMFs, everything that goes into that, Bluetooth headphones. I'm curious, because I've heard you talk about them before, I'm curious your thoughts about Bluetooth headphones and why they can be so detrimental to our health.
Yeah, very controversial subject, but arguably one of the most damaging things that somebody can do to themselves from a health perspective, because again, we have to think about things like the mitochondria. The mitochondria evolved to sense natural EMF, native EMF from the earth, like Schumann resonance, geomagnetic fields, all that. But they're not designed to sense non-native EMF at different frequencies and frequency rates. And so that has very real impacts on things like voltage-gated calcium channels, which allow calcium in and out of the cell. Very real impact on, mitochondrial health and their longevity. But more importantly, I think the melanin story is the biggest piece to this, because if you put AirPods into your brain, into your ear canals, the interesting thing is that there's a process known as the inverse square law, which basically says that whatever the source of native or non-native EMF, the farther you get away from it, the more exponential the drop-off is in terms of its effect on you. And so the farther away you can get from a non-native EMF source, the more protected you are. That's the most effective rule by far. And then, the closer you are to grounding, the better you are, and so forth. But when you put AirPods in, you are getting a Bluetooth signal, which I think is 2.45 gigahertz, and you're basically blasting your entire brain along with the melanin within your inner cochlea with that non-native EMF. And if you look through the research, this is scientific research that's readily available, I've talked about it, we know that melanin absorbs basically the entire electromagnetic spectrum. But melanin is a, 500 plus million year, multi-billion year adaptation that is not designed to sense non-native EMF, only native EMF. And so non-native EMFs directly destroy melanin within any part of the body. And so the interesting thing about melanin as well is that you can't have senses without melanin being in between you and that sense. And so if you look at hearing as a sense, there's a reason why people who wear AirPods and headphones routinely report tinnitus. That's a destruction in melanin. That's your brain basically trying to protect itself from the damage that has occurred. You look at neurodegeneration. I think neuromelanin within the brain, this has been linked very strongly, but Parkinson's has been tied very heavily to melanin destruction in the brain in the form of neuromelanin. And so it's arguably the worst thing you can do for your brain and for your body in general.
Wow. Yeah. And the proximity, as you mentioned, is key to that, because they're as close to your brain really as they possibly could be. And I saw a tweet one time that you mentioned somebody had a picture of their outlet right next to their bed at night, and the significance in terms of the detriment to their health that is. Why is that such a thing? And upon reading that tweet and deducing some of the logic behind it, I moved my bed to the center of my room. Because I want to be as far away from those things as possible, but at the same time, my room in this house that I'm renting is covered with outlets everywhere, so I just went to the center. But ideally, you'd have a dedicated bedtime, nighttime room where there's no power outlets and non-native EMF things there. But why is that specifically outlets and things perhaps in that camp also so detrimental?
Well, if you test outlets or even any part of the wall within most homes, I mean, you'll find that the electric fields are off the charts, the magnetic fields are off the charts. But the interesting thing is, even moving the bed a few feet away makes a dramatic difference. It almost removes the effect, to be honest. There may be some edge cases and exceptions, but that's, I think, the most important thing, is because you don't want to put your brain and your head, arguably the most important organ in your body along with the heart, right next to those non-native electric fields and magnetic fields. And so it's a very good hack that many people don't think about, and it doesn't require that you put on a tinfoil hat and basically Faraday cage your entire home. And so for me, that's a big one. What else was I going to mention? Yeah, I think at the end of the day, you're just using the inverse square law in your favor.
Yeah, totally. Uh, for somebody that's super healthy, because we've talked about somebody that's really not healthy, the more middle of the road health wise. For somebody that's super healthy, super locked in, understanding their circadian rhythms and the importance of it, getting out into the sun, what are maybe some of the smaller things that they could not be doing or be doing to increase their health even more to really fully maximize their function?
Yeah, it's a good question. Honestly, the more grounding you can do while getting the sunbathing and all that, ocean water if you can, or even in the forest or mountains, that's something that will just supercharge you until the end of time. I would say focusing more on seasonal and local dietary consumption is a big one, because that also ties into the circadian work. Because, people like Cruz and a lot of these other individuals talk about how food is essentially just a byproduct of photosynthesis. And so there's an electromagnetic barcode, so to speak, associated with each food. And so if you eat food that is not within your locale and not within your season that you're in, then that can become problematic. Because if you really look at food at its most fundamental layer, and you look at mitochondria, which are designed to, take in that energy from the food and absorb it into usable energy, we're just talking about protons and electrons. That's all we're talking about at the very quantum biophysical level. And so we're not talking about nutrients, although they're very important. But your mitochondria, in a very real sense, can scan, so to speak, the protons and electrons that come off of a given food that you eat. And so to what degree does this matter? Will it make or break your health? I don't know about that. I'm inclined to say no, but I think it's another layer of optimization if somebody wants to go down that route. And so I try to find a nice balance to where I'm not being neurotic about the work, but I'm also giving people some actionable and really high quality and detailed steps here.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think the seasonal eating is something that gets glossed over all the time, because at a grocery store we have such abundance here, particularly in America, that we don't really think of it. But that's how I'm sure we used to eat, without thinking about it on the flip side in the past.
Yeah, and then sorry to interrupt, but even on a deeper layer, like if we're talking about the seasonal variation to circadian rhythms and circadian alignment, during the summertime, you're essentially maximizing vitamin D3 through sunbathing and building a solar callus, more melanin, and then you're storing that vitamin D3 along with all the other metabolites of vitamin D to then prepare for the wintertime and really go through it. And so wintertime also serves a very important circadian function, because that's where you can use cold. Cold increases biophoton production within the body. Cold allows you to utilize more of that vitamin D3 that's stored in body fat, because it burns body fat. It creates more brown fat, which is more thermogenic and more mitochondrial dense. It also stimulates POMC. And then I think, one important thing is that endogenous melatonin in general, can actually tie to the vitamin D receptor. And so there's this almost shifting of systems according to season. So that's a big one that people can think about. And then, just also thinking about trying to dial in the seasonal aspect of that is key.
Yeah, and you've mentioned that when people get to the colder months of the year, the first thing they almost instinctively do is bundle up and they put on layers and layers and layers, but that actually can have an adverse effect rather than exposing themselves to the cold so their body can adapt. What's the importance and significance behind that?
Yeah, I'd say doing that in moderation is obviously key, because it's a very real stressor. So a lot of people like to take the ice baths or cold exposure way too far, but the importance of that is, number one, it stimulates POMC. POMC is, again, the world's most powerful drug factory in your body, essentially. Biophoton emission, meaning you're producing light from within that can then help systemic function. So, mitochondria make various wavelengths of light in the biophoton range, and all the way from UV to infrared to red, a few other wavelengths, I believe. That's going to be important. But I think in general, it's just it's creating more hormetic adaptation and more hormetic stress for you. And so the more you can adapt yourself to cold in the same way that your ancestors did, and also very high heat when the time is appropriate, the more resilient your health will become. And which is why I'm a big fan of, doing the sauna or doing the cold plunge. Sometimes for some people doing the contrast at the same, simultaneously. But either way, I think it turns on a different system of the body and has many different effects.
Yeah. And for somebody that, let's say, is in Florida in January, southeast Florida, and they're used to 75-degree temperatures and 85 degrees, and then they go up to Massachusetts, let's say, or Minnesota, instantly they get on a plane, and 4 hours later, they're in a completely different environment, and their body's, perhaps in flux in some way. What could somebody do to prepare for that? What could somebody do when they get there to best adapt most efficiently for that new environment?
Circadian alignment is going to be important if you're doing air travel. So for me, it's just about really trying to get in touch with the light and dark cycle wherever you land as soon as possible. So watching sunrise whenever you have a sunrise at your local destination or at your end destination. Grounding is also very important for its independent circadian benefits. And then also making it dark is going to be very key. So once you can really get the full scope of, full lux and full spectrum brightness during the day, and then you can get dark nights, it's going to take a few days, but you'll be aligned from a circadian perspective. In terms of getting adapted to the cold, if you move from Florida to a higher latitude environment, I would say probably, short burst cold showers is a good start. Or if you're more hardcore and it's like, 40, 50 degrees outside, then you just take your jacket off, have your shirt on, take your shirt off if you want, and just withstand the cold. Obviously don't go out into a blizzard and put yourself in a dangerous scenario, but just slowly over time get used to that exposure, and then eventually you will adapt, and very quickly actually.
Yeah, definitely. And I'd love to get more specific about routines, starting with the morning. If you were to design, a routine for yourself or somebody that really wants to dial in the morning, wake time, what to do after waking, light environment, sunrise watching, kind of the A to Z there, morning routine, what would that look like?
So for me, I'm pulling up the My Circadian app. By the way, the free version of that, great resource for people who want to understand the specific times here. So the My Circadian app on Android, Apple. So right now, sunrise is around 5:57 a.m. And I'll change this according to the season. But for me, I wake up around, let's say 5:50 a.m., wake up 5 to 10 minutes prior to sunrise. Daybreak usually happens way earlier than sunrise, maybe like 30 to 40 minutes prior. So you can also wake up at daybreak if you want, because you're still getting that spectrum of light, and that's also almost a signal for daytime, especially blue. So I'll wake up at that time, and then immediately I go outside. Almost immediately. It just at least for 5-10 minutes, just to start the process of circadian timing and signaling. Then I'll go back inside, do the normal routine stuff. And then within that first hour of waking, I will usually go for a brisk 30 to 45 minute walk. But the interesting thing about this is that usually now I'm trying to layer a more consistent breakfast into the equation, because meal timing is also circadian aligned. And so if I can manage to get a breakfast between sunrise and then before UVA rise, whatever it is, nutrient dense, I don't care what you choose, so long as it's nutrient dense according to your goals, then that's going to help layer on another external circadian cue that times the system correctly. And so the best way in my mind to start the morning would be to wake up before sunrise, have your breakfast prepared the night prior in the fridge, and immediately start eating breakfast outside while you're getting that full spectrum, red and infrared. Bar none, probably the most powerful thing you can do. And then if you want to take it an extra step further, you can do some exercise in the morning. You can do some cold exposure in the morning to further add another layer of circadian timing to the equation. But outside of that, the morning time is pretty simple. That makes up most of the morning stuff.
How would you time the exercise in the morning, post UVA rise?
For me, I could even work out within that sunrise to UVA window. I prefer not to do very high intensity stuff. So for me, it'll be like a zone 2, very methodical run where I'm just focused on breathing and not really pushing myself to a high degree. The sprints, the high intensity stuff, I like to do that stuff more so during midday, because I get most of the full spectrum and I'm really, really sweating, getting a lot of detox. But yeah, it just depends on the individual and their goals and circumstance.
Yeah, and then that's a good segue into the more middle part of the day. how would you continue to optimize routines there and getting out of the sun, sunbathing, etc.?
Yeah, so for people who work at home, I mean, trying to work out or work as much outside as you can is really key. So setting up like a little area where you can have your laptop, or if you're a big fan of the daylight computer, which I am, then you have that and you're using that outside. And then it's about just really spending time outside. It's such a simple and it's kind of overly simplistic answer, but that's really the truth. And then the midday sunbathing that depends on the individual's context. I mean, if somebody's a redhead, then just spend 1 minute outside.
Yeah.
So long as you're not burning. The point where you burn is the point at which you've gotten too much of that UV and you need to dial it back. But for me, I can spend like upwards of 3, 4, even 5 hours in high intensity UV. But the thing is, here's the important thing. People think I just spend that time fully outside under sunlight. I cycle between shade and sun, especially if it's really hot during the middle of summer, like right now, where it's like a 12, 13, 14 UV index.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sun, shade, and back and forth.
Yeah.
So as we're getting into the nighttime, and I'm curious how mealtime plays into even the middle portion of the day, but also the nighttime, and then into the evening bedtime routine. So how would that kind of optimized routine continue on through the rest of the day?
So very simple practices. Right now, sunset is at 7:58 p.m. So around that time, I intuitively just either open the window if I'm inside or go outside to watch sunset for as long as I can. As soon as the sun starts to go more towards the horizon, that's where you can implement more of the sun gazing. That's a whole different discussion that ties into the circadian eyesight regeneration. But, I just like to look, I don't look directly at the sun most of the time. I just look peripherally at it like a few degrees off. Mm-hmm. And so that's very important for circadian signaling. It really tells the body to prepare for circulatory melatonin production from the pineal gland. And then from that point, after nightfall, which in my area hits about 8:26 p.m., that's where it's full dark mode. So obviously during summer, you have longer light cycles, which means you have less time in darkness. But either way, once nightfall hits, no matter the time or season, that's when you go full dark mode, use the incandescents, use the beeswax candles, you wear the dark orange or red blue blockers, cover the skin with a basic layer of clothing to prevent any artificial light sources from hitting your skin and causing circadian disruption. And then for me, no food after that time, no food after sunset, and then very minimal liquid after sunset as well.
Yeah, you've
and then
mentioned
in bed before 10 p.m.
Yeah, you've mentioned the meal timing, like your last meal you really don't like to do after 7 p.m. What's the reason behind that, and why is that important for us?
So 7 p.m. it's not going to always be 7 p.m. That's
Right.
an important thing that I've heard people mention, and it's always going to shift with the seasons. But sunset is more so my cue. That's the cue to where I stop eating, because meal timing is heavily dictated by circadian timing. And so if you look at things like digestion under circadian control, if you look at something like blood sugar response and insulin production, also follow a diurnal pattern. So all of these things are under circadian control, which means that if you time meals correctly during the daytime, you get benefit from that end. If you time them incorrectly, you get negative metabolic response. So for me, if I eat anywhere after sunset, then obviously you're going to have, higher insulin, higher blood glucose response, which desires more insulin. That can lead to more body fat added to your frame. That can lead to all sorts of fat accumulation, visceral fat within the organs and whatnot. And even more important, like on the acid reflux standpoint, the important thing to understand is that there is a valve between your esophagus, the lower part of your esophagus, and your stomach. That's called the LES. I think it's called the lower esophageal sphincter. And the interesting thing about this valve is that it's designed to be open during the daytime and closed during the nighttime. And so if you actually eat food, you inappropriately relax that valve and allow it to open, leaving gastric juices to actually come up from the stomach, which means, that's basically acid reflux in a nutshell. And so if you do that on a long enough time frame, that's where you get into things like GERD, very serious problems with stomach acidity and whatnot. And then you also leave the door open for parasites and, again, so many knock-on effects. But It's just better from a body comp standpoint, metabolic health standpoint, circadian standpoint to avoid food after sunset, bar none.
Yeah, and even more specifically on the food and how it ties into receiving the sun, you've talked about seed oils and how they can increase the rates of burning and the severity of it. What's the importance there in terms of the quality of nutrition as it ties into circadian health?
Super important. I mean, look, it just makes sense that the quality of the food you consume, especially fat, is going to make up the quality of your cell membranes and overall body.
Yeah.
And so, if you're consuming already oxidized seed oils before they even enter your body, then that's going to be problematic from many different standpoints. I mean, not only are a big portion of the cell membranes made up of fat, but also you have to consider that seed oils, in my opinion, have been shown to increase chronic inflammation. And even if we're not looking at the science, because I think the science has still got a lot of catching up to do, there's a lot of anecdotal research on this. Like, people get annihilated from seed oil consumption if they do implement them into their diet. And, I think people can appreciate others' direct felt experience. And so for me, if you have a high level of chronic inflammation, if your cell membranes are not intact and they've become dysfunctional, and your mitochondria have become dysfunctional, which interestingly enough, mitochondria make ATP to actually fuel melanogenesis, melanin production, then you start to get into problems with the skin barrier. And so it only makes sense that you're at a higher susceptibility to get a burn.
Yeah, and you tie all of these things together, and somebody that's staying indoors all day, as we kind of started the podcast with the least optimal routines, and they're eating at night, some fast food chain in front of a blue lit TV, and they're waking up late, not getting the sun at all. It's not hard to see how they can get sunscreen or cancer. Excuse me. They're using sunscreen and sunglasses. It's not hard to see how their whole system is out of order and in dysfunction. What would you say are 2 to 3 of your... Well, before that, actually, I wanted to make sure I asked this question because I saw a tweet that said, I think the specifics was that going to bed or being asleep by 9 p.m. is exponentially more restorative than going to bed at 10 p.m. I'm sure that relates to the sunset in some way, but why is that?
It definitely relates to everything that we've talked about, but I think it's more so a function of sleep architecture. So another thing that's also under circadian control, but if you look at sleep architecture and how it's supposed to work in human beings across the board for most people, there may be some exceptions. There are some people who thrive off of like 5 hours genetically. They're few and far between in the population. But for me, the hours of anywhere between, let's say, pre-10 p.m., before 10 p.m., all the way up to 2 a.m., is a time for deep sleep. And deep sleep is about physical recovery. So think of recovery from of tendons, ligaments, muscles, anything physical in the body. That's where that recovery occurs. And so if you miss that portion of sleep, if you go to bed at midnight consistently, you're cutting into one of the most important processes or times of physical rejuvenation. And you're also missing out on this massive bolus or massive growth of growth hormone spike in that early part of the nighttime, which happens around like the first hour and a half of sleep. And so you don't want to miss that. From 2 to 6 a.m., that's mostly about emotional and mental and psychological recovery. That's where REM sleep happens. And so if somebody misses that portion of the night, they typically fall with some sort of mental issue or, inability to control emotions and whatnot, lack of executive function. So you really want to have all of those, both of those windows intact. And the reason why I say be in bed before 10 p.m. is because that is what gives you the most chance to be able to maximize both deep and REM sleep. And so you'll be able to go through all the sleep stages without having any interruption. And the moment I see that somebody is dealing with some sort of interruption from that perspective, that's when I start to look at their lifestyle and especially the nighttime routine as well to give me a more accurate diagnosis of what's going on. So, if somebody is peeing in the middle of the night, that tells me that vasopressin as a hormone is thrown off to some degree, which means that you're either drinking too much water at night, you're either, eating too late, or interestingly enough, you're being exposed to isolated blue light, at night, which actually throws off the circadian system, which is controlled which vasopressin is controlled by. So there are many of these different factors, but that's the most important one.
Yeah, it's fascinating how many things tie back to circadian health
It's crazy.
and function. Yeah, and the importance of it. You mentioned, and you've kind of built a little program around the 80-20 principle. I'm curious why that is, and then what the more specific details are around that.
Yeah, so I mean, it's basically a high level course that well, I mean, I have the coaching program, which I work with people one on one, whether they're CEOs or they're people every 9 to 5, everyday 9 to 5 guys who are just looking to optimize health in general. That ties into more of the coaching aspect. The course is more so geared around trying to teach people not only the science, but also the epistemology behind my thought process with this stuff. And then more importantly, I lay out all of the studies. I lay out different sections from mitochondria to the full spectrum to the synergistic relationship of light wavelengths. I have a section on the more directionally accurate truth about skin cancer. And so I go through melanoma, basal and squamous cell carcinoma. I tried to make it as comprehensive as possible, and I continue to add to it day by day, which is cool because I have the outline through Notion. But that's also tied to some video modules, which are more so high production. But I just want to give people either, some valuable information based off of where they are. So if they're a beginner, they're going to get so much out of this. If they're more intermediate, they're going to get a lot. If they're expert class, they're still going to get a lot. So, I tried to cater to everybody essentially through that.
Yeah, just like we've talked about today. That's awesome. I'm curious, kind of a rapid fire. And you can use anything that you've talked about, but what are 3 of your most contrarian health positions as opposed to centralized science and medicine and dermatology?
Oh, well, number one for sure. I mean, the fact that I believe that full spectrum sunlight does not cause any form of cancer. Yeah. It's actually protective against all cancers, and it does not cause photoaging inherently. I think there are other problems that lead to that.
What is photoaging, and what's the misnomer there?
It's basically the loss of collagen and elastin within the skin that actually makes the skin look more youthful. And so people say that UV light destroys collagen and elastin, but again, when you look at the research, they're showing isolated UV on skin cell cultures that have lost collagen and whatnot. So it just doesn't make sense in my mind, and there's a lot of the same flaws involved with the skin cancer stuff. But for me, if you look at full spectrum sunlight, it inherently improves the skin because the skin is a circadian light sensing barrier or organ, sorry. And so if you look at the entire skin barrier from the hypodermis to the epidermis, there are light sensing options. Collagen is produced from red and infrared, which take up most of the spectrum. UV light plays a key role in all of that, whether it be fibroblast function or mitochondrial function within the skin cells. And so it doesn't make sense to me, especially when you combine the early research of the 1900s showing that, full spectrum sunlight heals skin tuberculosis. It heals acne. I've had many people tell me it's healed their acne. And that's because UVA and blue light actually destroy the bacteria responsible for acne. And it's the most powerful thing for the skin in terms of youthfulness and overall health and longevity. So the full spectrum sunlight not causing skin cancer and photoaging is one.
What would, before the second and third, what would you say to somebody that says the sun causes wrinkling of the skin?
Again, that just comes down to a loss of collagen and elastin. And I would argue that there's never been a single high-quality study showing that full spectrum sunlight causes wrinkling or aging in that sense. Because, again, all the research they're using is using isolated UV. And if you have isolated UV on the skin of a human being, that's going to be damaging because it doesn't come from the full spectrum. It doesn't have that synergistic protective or hormetic effect that is offered by full spectrum sunlight. And so there are some real fundamental flaws with that study design that cannot be applied to full spectrum sunlight, just bar none.
And could that be related to receiving sunlight through glass, for example? Like, there's a famous trucker video where one side of his face is, looks very unhealthy compared to the other one. And people blame the sun. Well, he's receiving it through this window.
Oh, yeah. That's one of the most popular pieces of content I've created, actually. The covering of, talking about that 28-year truck driver on the road, and one side of his face is demolished, the other is not, relatively speaking. And I talk about how low emission glass changes the spectrum to actually focus UVA and blue light in isolation together. And it dramatically reduces red and infrared, which I think are the hormetic protective wavelengths that allow you to get the most out of UV and blue. And it makes complete sense when you look at that picture from the circadian lens. And it also makes sense that, dermatologists just blame that on the sun because they don't know about low emission glass. They don't know about the circadian stuff. So
Right.
for me, that's a key part of it.
Definitely.
The other two, it's such an interesting question. I would say that circadian eyesight regeneration is possible. That's a very controversial one. And then the idea that sunglasses, for the most part, are absolutely terrible for your health.
Yeah.
Believe it or not, I get more pushback on the sunglasses subject than I do the skin cancer subject.
I think people are probably defending their use of sunglasses. Probably they don't want to not use them. And to kind of close things up a little bit here, more holistically, what's the best decision you've ever made, or what's the best thing you've ever done?
From a health perspective, or just in general?
Life in general.
Probably get into soccer at 4 years old. I think that for me, that was a very pivotal experience that shaped the way I viewed reality and viewed myself. It developed a lot of confidence in my character and psyche, and so I'm very grateful for that. In the process of chasing a dream, I mean, like that's priceless. So that's, I think, up there. But to be honest, I think, having a child really takes the cake, because I have a 22-month-old son, and that is something that changes you even more so than, my experience with soccer or anything like that. So for me, that tops the list, because I've been able to implement a lot of the circadian work with my family. Bar none, best thing ever. Like, I can see this little dude. He has a mad tan, blue eyes, blonde hair, and that's some very fulfilling work.
That's beautiful. Yeah, thank you for sharing. What's something that you could leave the people with, a piece of advice, a tip, something that they can kind of hang their hat on?
I think the path to great health and freedom and in a proper mindset is through decentralized anything. Decentralized finance, decentralized health. But if you look at centralized systems, like, they're inevitably going to be controlled by power players, and so you're going to get a lot of BS, involved there. And so for me, I want people to have an open mind, especially on the circadian front. There are a lot of people who push back on me. Look at the stuff I'm posting. A lot of it's very logical, common sense, first principles, circadian understanding. But more importantly, I think just keep an open mind and try to educate yourself as much as you can, because that's the path to ultimate liberation in my mind.
Yeah, I fully agree. And it's, for me, as somebody that's super into the decentralized monetary system, Bitcoin, it's so fascinating to see how power and education and everything funnels towards centralization when you have a centralized monetary system that's able to wield its power. And so this shift that we're seeing across the board towards decentralized medicine, decentralized education, all of these things, decentralized food, is also coming with a shift toward decentralized money as well. And
we like new all-time highs for Bitcoin too. So
bring it on. always and forever. Well, alrighty, Zaid, it was super fun chatting. Where can the people reach you and find you?
Yeah, so we have me and my co-host have a podcast called the 2 a.m. podcast. We have a lot of cool guests on there. More so kind of aiming for that late night type of vibe conversation that you would have camping with friends or family. We don't actually record at 2 a.m. That would be unsustainable. We have some cool guests coming up. We have Mark Bell, actually. He's going to be on, or he's already been on. We just have to edit. And then outside of that, Instagram, Twitter, or X, and then Substack at Zaid K Dahhaj. So ZaidK Dahhaj.
Awesome. Yeah, I will put all of those links in the description. Thanks again for coming on, Zaid.
Yeah, cool. Been a really fun time, man.
Yeah, likewise. Until